So over here on the Material tab, this will display all the materials belonging to the selected object, and currently there are no materials present. But directly to the right of this Material tab, we have this kind of checkered looking icon, and this tab is for textures. However, the textures that will show up on this tab can be textures used all over the whole file. Textures used for brushes, for painting, or textures used for your world environment, basically what your background looks like when you're rendering and stuff like that, in addition to being the place where the textures that belong to that specific material live. To add a texture to this cube, we're going to need to first give it a material, because as far as objects go, textures live inside of the materials. So basically the material is the lunchbox and the textures are the sandwich and thermos, or however you want to think about it, but the textures live in the material, and then the material is on the object. So that's the hierarchy there. With this cube selected, we could press new, and we could just go ahead and rename this cube material here. So now that we have given this object a material, if we click over to the texture tab, once again we are using the Blender render engine and not cycles right now. Here in the textures tab, you'll notice these three icons up the top here. And these icons up here are asking which set of textures are we working with here. Are we talking about textures that belong to the world? Textures belong to the current material that you have selected on the object, or textures that are going to be used for texture brushes. So we want to be clicked on the material texture data here, because this is what belongs to this material. If you watched the Blender Render materials video, and I hope you did, then you will remember that right next to your object's material is a little button which will give you access to every material that exists in the entire file. So say for instance I were to double right click over here, add a monkey, and then give it some kind of material, and I just called it green monkey mat or something silly and made it green. Okay, so now there are a total of 2 materials in the entire file. So there's this green monkey mat, and then when we click on this cube, we see this cube material we made a second ago. When we click on this button, we have access to every material that exists in the file. So I could then, if I wanted to, give this cube that green monkey mat and change it from the material we gave it. But I'll go ahead and switch that back there. Okay, so the whole point of that, I'll go ahead and delete that monkey head there, was to say that the same thing is going on here with the materials textures here. Whenever we create a texture, we can click this little button here in the same way we can click the little button for the materials to gain access to all the textures that exist in the entire file. So if I were to say make a new texture here, and it's just this generic black blank texture here, but we could rename it so that we'll know that it's something specific. So we could call it cube texture, something super generic. And even if I were to click over to the world textures, I could still be able to access that texture I created, because this gives us access to all the textures in the entire file. And same with the texture brushes. So I'll go ahead and click back on the material tab data, because we are dealing with textures that are going to live inside of this material here. Also, in the same way that we talked about, the object has material slots, and slots are sort of like placeholders for the materials. We've got the same thing going on with textures. So when we added this new texture here, the type of texture that was created defaults to this image or movie type. And when the texture you create is set to image or movie, then that means the texture will either be using a still image, or you can actually use video clips as textures when you're making animations. So say for instance I had a short video clip and I were to put it on as a texture on this cube here, say it was like a video of like a ball bouncing or something, and maybe I had this cube set up to be like a TV. Then after you render the animation out, down here, each frame that goes by will render a different frame of that video clip that you put into the file. So it's possible to achieve some really sweet effects with that. But typically for this texture type, images are used. It's like JPEGs, PNG, TIFF, etc. We've also got this preview display here, which is currently black because we don't actually have an image loaded for this texture. So you can see what the texture will look like, how the texture looks on the material, or both together here, but in all cases we have nothing because we haven't loaded anything yet. And then right down here under image, where we can either create a new image to use as a texture or open one from our computer somewhere. In the same way, we have this little button here which gives us access to all the textures in the file, or on the material tab, this gives us access to all the materials that exist in the file. We can also select from any image that exists in the entire file, which of course currently there's none. So just so you're aware of that in the future. So for right now, we're going to go ahead and use an existing image. So we're going to load that image into that texture. This texture, of course, belongs to this material. And the image I'm going to use is just from the free Seamless Elemental Brush Sample Pack you can get from BlenderSensei.com. So if I click to my desktop here, here's this folder of images here, and you can download this on the store page for free here. Now, the default purpose of the Seamless Elemental Brush Pack is that they are seamless, non-pattern repeating textures to use as brushes for painting, but they can also be used as textures on your objects. So that's what we're going to do. So download that if you don't already have that, and then we're going to press open, and this sends us into the file browser. And I'm going to go ahead and click on my desktop because I have that bookmarked, but you may need to navigate through your computer's hard drive to get to the location of wherever you downloaded the Seamless Elemental Brush Pack, or maybe you have it in your library, or wherever. But we're going to want to navigate to that here. And let's go ahead and select this wallstone image here. So now that we've got this image loaded into this texture, we can finally see something more than just a blank black screen here, both in the texture view and the material view here. Okay, so there's a few things we need to talk about here, but the first most alarming thing is, well, we've got this material on this object, and this material has this texture, and this texture is using this image. So why can't we see the image on the object? So how your texture will be mapped onto your object is controlled in this mapping menu here of the texture menu. So if I go ahead and close up where it says image here and open where it says mapping. So the first thing under mapping here we see is where it says coordinates. And so this is asking, okay, I've got this texture here, either an image or a movie file, or one of these other texture types, which we're going to get into in another video. These other types here are known as procedural textures, and they're basically super cool math-generated images, but we'll get into that in a little bit. So what these coordinates value is asking is, how should this texture, or if you have a bunch of textures belonging to this material here, how should these be mapped on to this object? And so the default method is UV, which you've probably heard the term UV mapping before when talking about 3D objects and stuff. So UV basically just means X and Y, or length and width, basically because X, Y, and Z were already taken up to define the actual dimensions of the object. The coordinates U and V were created to represent the flat, stretched out map of how textures and specifically images will be mapped on to objects. So right now we're not seeing the image belonging to this texture, which belongs to this material, which is on this object. We're not seeing it show up because this object has no UV maps. So if you come over here to the object properties, which this panel of course will display only the object properties of whatever object you happen to have selected. So we've got this cube selected here. When we click UV maps, notice that it is empty. So because there's no UV map, there's no instructions on how to pin these textures onto this object, we can't see them. So while you're working with materials and textures and things, you may want to go ahead and switch this to material, or you can just use Alt-Z, which is the hotkey to switch back and forth between solid and material viewport shading. So there are other types of coordinates besides UV. Although UV gives us the most control because it allows the creator to give specific instructions about how the textures and images are to be placed onto the object, so that's what's used most of the time. But there are other methods which are automatic, such as generated here. So notice once we switch this over to generated that we are actually able to see the texture which is inside the material which belongs to the cube. However, it doesn't look super great for the sides of this object. Typically, any other type of coordinates besides UV is going to mostly be for using procedural textures, or else they're not going to look that great. But you do also have some options which can be used for additional effects faux lighting or reflection effects, like if you're working with a video game object, such as reflection here. And so however we move around this cube, we'll see this texture change. Now obviously this isn't a great texture to use in this situation, but imagine you just had a very small texture with like just a few shiny glares or something on it, and then you had that mixed in with other textures, and it was just like a very small part of it. It becomes possible to add some really sweet effects if you're working with video game assets. But we'll get into these other mapping types later, but for right now, let's talk about your main bread and butter, your main workhorse of texture mapping, which is of course UV. So let's switch that back to UV there. So there are several ways that we can add a UV map to our object. The most simple way, of course, is to just click on this plus sign where it says UV maps, and this will give us a generic UV map. So I can click this, and as soon as I do that, we're now finally able to see this texture, which belongs to this material, which the material is on this object, because it finally has coordinates. It finally has instructions on, okay, how should I be mapped onto the object? But pressing this button here will just generate the most basic, simple UV map, and may work for objects that are very simple, like a cube or something, but typically you're going to have to edit your UV map in a number of ways, which we'll talk about. So I could go ahead and click the minus sign there to get rid of that UV map. And the other normal way of creating UV maps is in edit mode. So if we press tab to go into edit mode, and we press T to bring up our tool shelf, if we click on the Edge Tools button, we have all the access to our UV creating type stuff. Down here we have different unwrap methods, and so if I were to just press this default unwrap method here, this would basically do the same thing as pressing this plus sign and just generate a very basic UV map. There's other automated options for creating UV maps, but typically, unless your object is really simple or you're just really lucky, they're not going to give you the precise kind of control you want on your UV map. So the other place besides edit mode that you're going to be editing and adjusting UV maps is in the image editor, which is also called the UV/image editor. So if I come down here and click this button here in the bottom of the 3D view menu header here, this gives us access to one of Blender's 17 or so different editor types. And if we click on the image editor, and we also happen to be in edit mode with an object selected that has a UV map, we'll be transported to adjust that object's UV map. Before I go any further, I thought I might take just a second to kind of better explain what a UV map really is. So a UV map is a lot like this. So here we have this horrible image of this bearskin rug, which I think's fucking gross, but I also think provides a good example of what UV maps are. So when you're dealing with UV maps, what you're really thinking about is, in what way would I split something open so I can lay it flat to be able to paint onto it or adjust images over that flat area, so that when the flat area is wrapped back around the object, it makes sense. The process of UV mapping is a lot like taxidermy, and in Blender and other 3D modeling programs, we can actually mark the seams on objects where we want to split something open to be stretched out onto a flat surface, much in the way that cut lines had to be placed into this bear's flesh. So the cut lines probably went underneath the arms here, down underneath here, and then of course obviously one starting from the head down to its groin area. And so those marks had to be figured out and cut open first before this thing could be laid out flat. So for instance, if we click on this go back button, which will take us back to the 3D view, we'll say we were to press tab to go back into object mode. Let's go ahead and add a monkey head so I can show you a little bit better about what this taxidermy UV mapping process is really all about. Notice also that when I switched over to this Suzanne monkey head from this cube, that this monkey head has no textures. It also has no material belonging to it, so we don't even have the material option up here to give it textures as we do with the cube. So what we could do is, on the material tab, we could go ahead and press new to give this monkey a new material. We'll just call it monkey material, I suppose. And under texture, with the material tab selected here, So we could press new here. And of course, the default type is already image or movie. And under image, we could go ahead and press open and give this a different image from our seamless elemental sample pack. So I'll click on my desktop where I have this located and select this fabric knitted wool texture here. And I'll go ahead and press W out here in the 3D view a few times to give this monkey head some smoothing. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close up where it says image and open mapping back up here. Of course, there are no UV maps existing for this Suzanne head, so there's no way for Blender to know how to map the textures that belong to this material that belongs to this object onto the object. So this time, rather than pressing plus to generate a generic UV map, let's press tab to go into edit mode. And what we're going to do with the Suzanne head is basically like the terrifying taxidermy bear thing, is we're going to select lines where we would want to cut this old girl open so we could stretch her out flat on the floor and then be able to paint or move images over that flat surface so that when it goes back to being wrapped around the object, it will make sense. So what I'm going to do is shift scroll up to make sure I am in edge selection, which I already am, and I'm going to press Alt and click this line going around the face because I think this would be a good area to make a cut line like a taxidermist would. Okay, so now that I've got my first cut line made around the Suzanne head, I can actually add this by pressing Mark Seams. Now, if I deselect off somewhere, we can see that even after everything's deselected, we've still got this thick orange line denoting where one of our UV mapping taxidermy cut line is going to go. Next, I want to place two of them inside of the head around each of these eyes. So I'm going to Alt select this one, then Shift Alt click this one to add to that selection so I can go ahead and make two marked seams at the same time. Go ahead and press Mark Seams there. So now I've told Blender so far that, okay, when I unwrap this, I want the cut line to go around here. And I want cut lines to go around these eyes so that the eyes will be laid out flat and so on. So with a lot of objects, you're not going to necessarily know straight away exactly the way you're going to want to cut them. It's just, some of it's trial and error. But we could go ahead and try to make some cut lines for the ears. So I could Alt select this line here. What I'm going to do is Shift select these lines up here to connect this. And I'll go ahead and press Mark Seams there. And do the same thing over here. Make a similar cut there. I think that's the same. Let's see, yeah. And I could just press Mark Seams again. Okay, so now I've told the taxidermist all the cut lines I want to make on this Suzanne head, so how everything is to be stretched out flat for my UV map. Next, what I need to do is select all the mesh that I want to unwrap. So that could just be, maybe I just want to unwrap this actual front face here. So I could, hold C and use my circle select brush, maybe tap space to go into face selection. So I could do that a little faster. So if I only wanted to unwrap this bit, I could. But because I've went ahead and made cut lines around the whole thing, I'm going to go ahead and press A to select all. And now under unwrap, I'm just going to use this regular unwrap method. But now because we have seams on it, cut lines basically, we'll get a very different UV map. So here, I'll click unwrap there. And now if we press tab to go back into object mode, we can see the texture onto our object because we have generated this UV map. So let's go ahead and switch to the image editor here. And I'm going to click on this button as we discussed. Whenever you see a little button like this, it means access to all of those files. So this is for images, so all the images that exist in the whole file. So let's select the fabric knitted wool, which is what we are using on the Suzanne head here, and I'll go ahead and zoom in on the Suzanne head here. And right now we're just looking at the image, but to get to the UV map, all we do is press tab to go into edit mode. And that of course puts us in edit mode for the object, but also edit mode for this UV map. To make this to where we can see the actual image under the UV map, after pressing tab to go into edit mode, we will then click back on the fabric knitted wool. And finally, we have the UV map being overlaid over the actual image we're using. So notice a few things. Notice that since we marked that seam around the entire front face of Suzanne's head, that this part of the map looks like the head, and then where we marked the ears, we can see those, and where we marked the outer edges of the eyes, each of the eyes, we can see those. So hopefully by now you are getting the picture that a UV map actually consists of a direct relationship between each of the individual faces on the actual object. So if I were to select some random face on the Suzanne head, we'll see its corresponding face on the UV map. So if I were to hold C to do a circle selection over one of these eyes, you can see that all getting selected on the UV map here. If I were to go ahead and in the 3D view, press A to select everything. For instance, I could do a border select and just select one of these eyes here. And so if we come down here and are looking at the Suzanne head and I press G to grab this, notice that as I move this part of the UV map, that only the image over the mesh that it corresponds to changes. This is how we get precise control over where things go. So we can also do transform operations like scaling this part of the UV map, R to rotate, etc. So I could do something similar and just select, holding C to use my circle select brush, select the other eye, and hold C and hold down middle mouse to deselect that part of the ear because I don't want that. And we can adjust this as well as the face down here. And I'm going to press Control and right click to do a lasso select to select this part of the face here. Make sure I got all that. So now if I back up a little bit, I could press S to scale this way down and make just this part where we mapped the face on, expand. I could rotate this, etc. So say I had some image loaded in here which had little decals or scratches or some kind of sticker or something, and we wanted that to be placed on a certain area. All we would do is select the part of the UV map where we wanted it to correspond and move it over there. Of course, you have to make sure everything blends in together and makes sense, which you can manipulate that image later on. Because all that's happening is we are moving the skin of this object around of this image, which the image is still just coming from the desktop here, this actual fabric knitted wool JPEG image. We could actually paint, right onto this image here. If we switch this from view to paint, I could then say paint over this eye here. And you can see it showing up down here in the 3D view. Or if I were to say paint around the edges of the face here, we'll see that show up here. If I press Tab to go into object mode, so we can see that a little bit better there. Press Tab to go back into edit mode. And I chose a texture that was really light, which maybe I shouldn't have done because it's kind of hard to see this here. But I could do rings around the eyes like this. And we'll see that all show up here on the image. Now, obviously, you can do a lot more advanced things if you're just, editing this image in Photoshop or something. And in a video coming up, I'm going to show you how you can very quickly and easily do that in Blender with, programs like Photoshop or free programs like GIMP.